Hi, I am Karan, and welcome to my talk on the art of complex deployment strategies in Kubernetes using Argo Rollouts. In this talk, you can expect to learn about the different deployment strategies that are out there, their pros and cons, and their use cases as well. Then we will be taking a look at Argo Rollouts, how to set it up in a Kubernetes cluster, and how we can create the blue-green deployment strategy along with the canary release deployment strategy. After this, we'll be taking a look at the best practices for setting up the different deployment strategies, along with the common challenges that are faced while setting these strategies up. So I hope you are excited for this talk. Let's get into it. Before getting into the actual talk, just a brief introduction about myself. I am currently working as a software engineer at this company called Storylane. It's a Y Combinator backed company, and we specialize in creating demo automation software. Prior to working for Storylane, I worked for HackerRank, specifically the labs team at HackerRank, where we were responsible for building moonshot product ideas for the company. I primarily specialize in the DevOps and the backend domain, and I work with technologies like Kubernetes, Docker, Helm, Golang, Node.js, Ruby on Rails, etc. on a day-to-day basis. I also have a technical blog. You can check it out on my website, karanjagtiani.com/blog. So let's not waste any more time and let's jump into what are zero downtime deployment strategies. So this is a brief overview of how a user interacts with an application through a load balancer and how we ideally want to deploy a new release of the application without affecting the user experience and without causing any downtimes in the deployment. So why is zero downtime necessary? Of course, if there is any downtime in the application, it can affect the revenue of the business. It can also affect the user experience. So there can be cases where multiple versions of a application are deployed and some requests from the user are going to the older version, some are going to the newer version. So there can be discrepancy in the user experience. Then it can also hamper the customer trust in the application and the company as well. And also, in a lot of the cases, there are SLA obligations by the company to its customers. So these are a few reasons why zero downtime deployments are necessary. Before diving into the different deployment strategies that are out there, first let's take a look at the basic architecture of a application running on a Kubernetes cluster. So when a user is interacting with your application, it does that through the DNS, which routes the traffic to the load balancer, which then routes it to the ingress of Kubernetes. And that routes it to the service responsible for the application in Kubernetes, and the service then finally routes the traffic to the deployment. We also have our cluster admin, which is responsible for maintaining the deployment, the service, and the ingress of the application. So this is just a brief overview of the Kubernetes architecture as a prerequisite for the later stages, specifically the demo part of the video. So Kubernetes out of the box offers us to use two different deployment strategies. One is the recreate deployment strategy and another is the rolling deployment strategy. So first, let's take a look at the recreate deployment strategy. So this is a brief overview of how the recreate deployment strategy works. The process goes this way. First, the current deployment is deleted, then a new deployment is created, and then the user is redirected to the new deployment. So you can see a problem over here that while the deployment is happening, while the new deployment is being created, there is going to be a downtime and the user won't be able to interact with the application during the deployment. So here are the pros and cons of this deployment strategy. Let's go through the pros first. So it's easy to implement. It does not take up any additional resources because first the older deployment is deleted, then the new one is created. So essentially it keeps using the same amount of resources always. Then it also helps prevent data conflicts. So if there are two different deployments simultaneously trying to connect to a same data source, so there may be some conflicts. So this helps with that issue. It is also helpful in architectures where you don't want multiple versions of your application running simultaneously. Then let's go through the cons next. There is a downtime as we discussed while the deployment is happening. It is not suitable for high availability applications. There is a slower rollout process because if let's say there are hundreds of pods and you're waiting for all of those pods to be created, then it's going to be a time consuming process. And there is also a risk of deployment failure because the first thing that we do is delete the old deployment and then create the new one. So if there is any issue in the new deployment, then there is going to be a problem. So yeah, let's jump into the use cases of this deployment strategy. So these are the use cases of the recreate deployment strategy. It can be used in non-production environments where the application is not required to be highly available. And it can also be used in cases where two different versions of the application cannot be writing to the same data source, like a single tenant database. So yeah, let's jump into the rolling deployment strategy next. So this is how the rolling deployment strategy looks like. Uh, in contrast to the recreate deployment strategy, it does not delete the older version of the application first. What it does is it creates the new version of the application in a rolling or a gradual way. So what it does is it will create some pods of the new application, and until those new pods are completely in the running state, it will not delete the older pods. So essentially it will roll out the deployment in a gradual manner. So here are the different use cases for the rolling deployment strategy. This is a really good strategy for your dev environment or your staging environment. It is also a good strategy if your application requires a gradual rollout process. And it is also resource efficient because it will not maintain multiple deployment states of your application. It will gradually roll out the new release. So it is also resource efficient. So now let's jump into some of the more complex deployment strategies. So first, let's take a look at the canary release deployment strategy. Here, the deployment strategy asks us to create a canary group, and that canary group is going to be responsible for serving to a subset of your traffic, let's say 20%, and 80% of the traffic will go to your original deployment. So you can see that it is sort of similar to the rolling deployment strategy where the rollout is going to be gradual in nature, but it is fundamentally different than the rolling deployment strategy because over here we are going to have full control over the canary group, essentially the group which is going to be responsible for serving the subset of your traffic. So let's take a look at the pros and cons of the canary release deployment strategy. Let's first go through the pros. So this deployment strategy is really good at risk mitigation because of the canary group and the concept of serving to only a subset of users. It also gives real world feedback because of the fundamental process of the deployment. Again, this is similar to the rolling deployment strategy where the rollout happens in a gradual manner, but here we have full control over the rollout process. And there is also a option for a quick rollback. So if that canary group, which is serving to a subset of users, showcases some issue in the deployment, then we can quickly roll back to the old group, which was already serving to most of the traffic. Now let's go through the cons of this strategy. It is complex in routing. So setting up the routing for this is a complex task. And there is a monitoring overhead. And also there can be inconsistency in user experience because of the canary group concept. And there is also a limited testing scope when the deployment is happening. Here are the use cases for the canary deployment strategy. If you want real world feedback, so this is a really good strategy for you. It is also useful in performance sensitive deployments because of the concept of the canary group. And if you also want continuous deployment environments where there is no downtime, this is also a good use case for that. Now let's take a look at the blue-green deployment strategy. Personally, this is my favorite. So in this strategy, you maintain essentially two different deployment groups. One is the green deployment and one is the blue deployment. So the green deployment is responsible for serving your real-world traffic. It is responsible for your production application. And the blue deployment is essentially a copy of the green deployment. So this is how the process goes when you create a new release. First, the application will be deployed to the blue environment. And in the blue environment, you can do your testing, you can see how your application is behaving. And once everything is good to go, you can swap the blue environment with the green environment. So essentially, blue now becomes green and green now becomes blue. And green was already serving the old application. So now it essentially becomes the blue deployment. So this is how the blue-green deployment works. Let's jump into its pros and cons. There is essentially zero downtime when you use the blue-green deployment. You can immediately roll back to your previous deployment because of the blue-green strategy. You can easily test your application as well in the blue environment. So what usually companies do is that consider the blue environment as the UAT or pre-prod environment where you can do the testing before converting it to the green environment. And you can also load test that particular environment easily. Now, here are the cons. It is resource intensive. You essentially have to maintain two copies of the same deployment. It is complex in data management because of the same reason. And there are potentials for unused resources. The blue environment can be sitting idle for long periods of time. And there is also complexity involved in the configuration and the routing of the deployment strategy. So here are the use cases of the blue-green deployment strategy. If you are looking for a strategy that allows you to keep your application highly available, a very critical production environment, then this is a really good strategy to consider. And this is also a strategy which allows you to do robust testing before releasing it to the public. So the goal of this talk is to not only talk about the different deployment strategies that are out there, but also about how we can implement the blue-green deployment strategy along with the canary release strategy in a Kubernetes environment. And for that, we will be using this tool called Argo Rollouts. So let's take a look at what this tool is. So Argo Rollouts is a cloud native open source tool built for Kubernetes where we can create these complex deployment strategies like the blue-green deployment strategy or the canary release deployment strategy. It also allows us to easily roll back to the older deployment, and it also allows us to easily configure the traffic routing in the Kubernetes environment. So it gives us a very neat dashboard to do all of this stuff. So we'll be taking a look at that dashboard and how we can set up these strategies in the demo part of this video. All right, it is about time now. Let's get into the demo part of the video and let's see how we can set up Argo rollouts in a Kubernetes environment. All right, we are in the demo part of the session now. In this section, we will be going over the blue-green deployment strategy along with the canary release deployment strategy using Argo rollouts in a Kubernetes environment. In order to set up the Kubernetes environment on our local system, I will be using the Kubernetes in Docker tool. All the prerequisites for this demo session are going to be provided in a README file, and this is going to be part of a GitHub project. The link to this GitHub project will be provided at the end of this talk. So let's jump straight into the terminal and get started. So the first thing that we can do is create a Kubernetes cluster using kind on our local system. We can do that by running the kind create cluster command, and you can provide a name as well if you want. It's not required. I'll be providing Argo rollouts demo. I would be going ahead and running this command since I've already created the cluster. Once your kind cluster is created, what we can do is we can ensure that we are on the correct Kubernetes context. We can use the kubectx tool for that. Whatever clusters that are created using the kind tool, it is prepended using kind. So just add kind and the name of your cluster. So yes, once we have switched to the correct context, we can go ahead and see the blue-green deployment demo. Jumping back into VS Code again, I have gone ahead and created these two uh, service YAML files. One is the green service YAML file and another is the blue service YAML file. Both of these services are going to be pointing to the same app selector, which is going to be Nginx, and the same target port, but just the name is going to be different. This is going to be Nginx blue and this is going to be Nginx green. Another file that I have created is the argo rollout.yaml file. Over here, we can provide the active service as well as the preview service. So active service is going to be the service through which the live traffic is going to be routed. And the preview service is going to be the one which is going to act as the essentially the one which acts as a test bed for us. And I have also disabled the auto promotion. So auto promotion essentially is a concept of Argo rollout where unless and until we go ahead and click the promote button in the dashboard or run the promote command through the CLI, it will not go ahead and scale down the green deployment and switch the blue and the green replica sets. So during this time, we can do whatever testing that we want, load testing, test the application's behavior, and test the new release changes. So initially, we are going to be starting off with a Nginx and a particular release Docker tag. And in order to test the change between the two deployments, the green and the blue deployment, I'm just going to make one minor change and I'm going to change this to latest. So that's how we are going to see the deployment in action. So yeah, let's jump back into the terminal and apply all these YAML files. So before running the YAML files, I just want to show everything that is present in the default namespace. So we can get that by running this command kgetall. And just for context, I have set an alias for the kubectl CLI tool with K. So this is essentially running kubectl under the hood. So as you can see, there is nothing but the default Kubernetes service running that comes out of the box when you run the Kubernetes control plane. So now we can go ahead and start applying our YAML file. So first, let's apply the green service.yaml file. Then we can apply the blue service.yaml file. And finally, let's apply the rollout file as well. Now, if I go ahead and get all in the, you can see that there are two pods running because that is what we specified in the rollout.yaml file. Two services have been created, Nginx Blue and Nginx Green, and the replica set for the blue deployment essentially, which is running as of now. I can also show the rollouts that have been created. So this is a CRD, the Argo Rollouts project. So Nginx rollout has been, in order to view the rollout that we just created, we can do that on the Argo Rollouts dashboard. And in order to spin that up, we can run the following command, kubectl Argo Rollouts dashboard. Keep in mind, this command will only work if the Argo Rollouts plugin has been installed in the Kubernetes cluster. The installation guide for installing the plugin is also present in the README of the GitHub project. So let's go ahead and run this command. As you can see, the dashboard is now available at port 3100. So let's jump into the browser and see our rollout in action. As you can see, the rollout that we created is present over here, Nginx rollout, and it's using the blue-green strategy. So let's click on this. As you can see, the image that we had provided is mentioned here. It is stable and active. Two pods are running as of now. So what I'll do is I'll jump back into VS Code, change the image tag to latest, and let's see the blue-green deployment in action. So here I have made the one change to latest, and I'll apply this YAML file and let's see how it behaves in the browser. So as you can see, a new revision is being created right now. And since we set the auto promotion to false, what it is doing is right now it is maintaining both the states, the green deployment as well as the blue deployment. And once I click on the promote button over here, then it will essentially swap the two between the blue and the green, and it will make the green deployment as the live deployment, essentially converting it into blue. And the previous deployment, the older deployment, will be scaled down in 30 seconds. So you can change the scale down time as well if you want. But since we have any disabled the auto promotion, then we don't really need to change that time because we can take however long we want before clicking this button. So I'll go ahead and click on yes. So now, as you can see, the active state changed. So essentially the swap between blue and green happened. And now the older deployment has a timer over here. So within 15 seconds or so, it will be scaled down. So this is how the blue-green deployment strategy works using Argo rollouts. I hope this was helpful. Now let's jump into the canary release deployment strategy. For the canary release deployment demo, I have gone ahead and created these two YAML files. One is the service.yaml file. It is a pretty straightforward Kubernetes service that is targeting port 80. And another file is the Argo rollout.yaml file. This time the strategy specified is the canary strategy. And over here we are following the same methodology where the Nginx image is provided, and later we will be changing this tag to latest, and we'll see how this deployment behaves in real time on the Argo Rollouts dashboard. So I have gone ahead and applied the two YAML files that I just showed you. And once we do that, this is the dashboard that we get for the canary release deployment. And as you can see, the dashboard is a bit different compared to the blue-green deployment strategy. There is one more panel over here, which contains the steps of the canary deployment. So essentially what happens is that through each step, so each step we can set a wait, and after that we can set a pause. So a pause can either be indefinite in nature. So in this case, we would have to go and manually promote the deployment. Otherwise, we can provide the pause in seconds so that it automatically gets promoted. So since we have 5 pods in our deployment, essentially what will happen is that at each step, so 20%, 40%, 60%, one single pod will be added into our canary group. So at 20%, one pod will be added because 20% of 5 is one. Then after we promote manually through this pause section, then another pod will be added at 40% and so on. You get the gist of it. So now let's jump back into VS Code, change the image tag from this to latest, and let's see this in action. So as you can see, I have changed this to latest and I'll apply this YAML file and let's see how it changes the deployment behavior. So as you can see, a new revision was created with the tag of latest, and over here it has been paused on this step. So now what we can do is we can test our deployment. Since the canary group is essentially 20% of the deployment, we can test this particular small subset. And once we are good to go, once we get the green light, we can promote manually by clicking over here. Are you sure? So yes. So as soon as I clicked on yes, another pod was added. And now it is going to go through a automatic pause of 10 seconds. So after 10 seconds, it should add another pod into the revision 2. It did that. Yeah, this is essentially how the canary release deployment strategy works. And if you remember the YAML file that we saw for this strategy, we have complete control over the steps over here, and we can have even more steps after this. We can change the percentage, the weight, the pause duration, and essentially we have complete control over it. So yeah, this was the demo part of this talk. I hope you enjoyed this. Now let's jump back into the slides and go over the best practices for creating zero deployment strategies. All right, so we are done with the demo part of the session. Now let's get into the best practices of zero downtime deployment strategies. The first one is that your deployment strategy should allow you to rigorously test your application in a live environment. So as we saw that canary release and blue-green deployment, both of them allow us to do that. We also want real-time monitoring so that if there is issue during the rollout or even after the rollout, we are aware about it. Also, the deployment strategy should be able to uh, handle any issues during the rollout so that if there are any issues, there is a graceful degradation, meaning that the entire application does not go down, some part of the application goes down. And finally, traffic control. Your deployment strategy should be able to also handle the traffic control complexities in the live environment. Here are some of the common challenges and pitfalls while implementing zero downtime deployment strategies. One is inadequate rollback procedures. So I have seen this multiple times where there are no rollback procedures, and when something goes down, then it gets very scary and difficult to roll back to the previous working deployment. Then overlooking any dependency management is also a common pitfall that I have seen. Insufficient load testing. Without load testing the application, if we go ahead and deploy, that can also be a very scary thing and can cause issues in the live environment. Ignoring database migrations. This is something that is very common. So if there is a migration in the newer version and that migration was not applied in the older version, and if you're going ahead with a blue-green deployment, then your blue environment can go down or your green environment can go down if the migration is executed in one or the other environments. Neglecting user experience during rollouts is also a very common challenge because as you try to maintain two different states of your application, there can be inconsistencies when the user hits both of the environments. And finally, incomplete monitoring configuration. That is also one of the common challenges while creating these complex deployment strategies. So please be mindful of all of these common pitfalls and challenges so that your entire process and your life is a lot smoother. So we are done with the session. Thank you. Thanks a lot for sticking till this point. I hope that I was able to convey all of the topics in a manner that was helpful to you. If you want to connect with me, you can find all of my links present on the screen right now. One easy way would be to scan the QR code on the left. It will take you to a page where all of my links are present. And also, I have made the project that we used in the demo part of this session available on GitHub for you to access and use. So, yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this session and thank you for having me.